The 47th floor of the Clark Industries building housed Ethan Clark's office, a space that screamed wealth from every corner. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan's skyline, but Ethan wasn't looking at the view. His attention was fixed on the 65-inch screen mounted on his wall, displaying a documentary about homelessness in New York City. The documentary showed raw footage of people huddled in doorways, sleeping on subway grates for warmth, and lining up at soup kitchens. Something about their faces caught Ethan's attention, not pity, but a nagging sense that he was missing something important about the world outside his climate-controlled office. "Mr. Clark, your 2 p.m. is waiting," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Cancel it," Ethan replied, not taking his eyes off the screen. "Cancel everything for the rest of the day." He watched as the documentary interviewer spoke with a woman who had once been a successful real estate agent. One bad month, a medical emergency, and a series of unfortunate events had left her homeless. The woman's story wasn't unique. The documentary went on to show bankers, teachers, and even former executives who had fallen through society's cracks. Ethan pulled up his banking app. His personal account showed a balance that could sustain a small town for years. He closed it, feeling a strange mix of guilt and curiosity. The contrast between his reality and what he was watching became increasingly stark. Later that afternoon, Ethan found himself in a thrift store in the Bronx, far from his usual tailored suit shops. He picked through racks of worn clothing, selecting items that would help him blend in with the street population: a threadbare jacket, faded jeans, scuffed boots. The store clerk gave him odd looks as he paid in cash. In the store's grimy bathroom, Ethan changed into his new clothes. He stuffed his expensive watch and phone into a worn backpack, leaving only a basic burner phone and some cash. Looking in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. His clean-shaven face and neat haircut still betrayed his background, but that would change with time. The first step onto the street as his new persona felt surreal. People who would normally stop and stare at his designer suits now walked past without a second glance. He was invisible, exactly what he wanted. Ethan spent the next few hours walking through different neighborhoods, observing the stark transition from affluent areas to struggling communities. He noticed things he'd never paid attention to before: the locations of public bathrooms, which stores would let people linger without buying anything, where people could find shelter from the rain. As evening approached, he found himself in a small park where several homeless individuals had gathered. They sat in loose groups, some talking quietly, others keeping to themselves. Ethan settled on a bench, maintaining enough distance to observe without intruding. One group caught his attention. They were sharing food from a paper bag, passing around what looked like sandwich halves. A woman in the group moved with a familiar grace that made him pause. Something about the way she tilted her head, the gesture she made with her hand, it tugged at his memory, but he couldn't place it. The woman had long, tangled hair that obscured most of her face. Her clothes were layers of mismatched items, but she moved with purpose as she distributed food to others in the group. She seemed to be organizing them, making sure everyone got a fair share. Ethan found himself staring, trying to place why she seemed familiar. When she turned slightly, the setting sun caught her profile, and his breath caught in his throat. But before he could get a better look, she disappeared behind a cluster of people. The growing darkness brought a new energy to the park. People began settling into their sleeping spots, some pulling out cardboard to create makeshift beds. Ethan realized he needed to leave. He wasn't ready to spend the night on the streets, not yet. But as he stood to go, his eyes kept returning to the spot where the woman had been, that nagging sense of recognition still pulling at him. Walking back to his car, parked several blocks away in a secure garage, Ethan knew this wouldn't be his last visit. He had seen enough to know he needed to understand more, but that woman's familiar presence had awakened something else, a mystery he felt compelled to solve. The next morning, Ethan returned to the park dressed in his homeless disguise. He carried a bag of sandwiches from a local deli, using them as an excuse to approach the group he'd observed the previous day. The early morning air was crisp, and several people huddled around a makeshift fire in a metal trash can. "Anyone hungry?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice rough and uncertain. He'd practiced the tone at home, trying to shed his usual confident manner. An older man with a gray beard looked up at him suspiciously. His name was Tom, as Ethan would later learn, and he served as an unofficial guardian of the group. "Nothing comes free out here, friend. What's your angle?" "No angle," Ethan replied, holding out the bag. Just trying to share what I've got." Tom studied him for a long moment before nodding slightly. "Sit down then. But watch yourself. Streets aren't kind to newcomers who don't know the rules." Ethan distributed the sandwiches, careful to make eye contact with each person who took one. A young woman with track marks on her arms thanked him quietly. A teenage boy who looked too young to be on the streets grabbed 2 sandwiches and retreated to a corner. As they ate, conversations started flowing. People began sharing snippets of their stories, not the full versions, but enough to paint a picture. A man lost his job after an injury and couldn't pay his medical bills. A woman fled an abusive husband with nothing but the clothes on her back. Each story added another layer to Ethan's understanding of how fragile security could be. "You should talk to Emily," someone mentioned, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "She helps newcomers figure things out. Keeps us organized, you know." "Emily?" Ethan tried to keep his voice steady. "Yeah, she's been here about 2 years now. Used to have some fancy life or something, but she doesn't talk about it much. Helps people get ID cards, knows which shelters are safe, which ones to avoid." Tom interrupted, "She'll be at the shelter on 23rd Street later. They're serving dinner at 6. She always helps with the distribution." Ethan spent the next few hours learning the unwritten rules of street life from Tom. Don't sleep alone. Keep your important documents in a plastic bag. Know which cops are decent and which ones will hassle you. The information flowed freely now that he'd been accepted, at least provisionally. As evening approached, Ethan made his way to the shelter Tom had mentioned. The line for dinner already stretched around the block. He joined it, his stomach turning knots as he approached the entrance. Inside, volunteers moved efficiently, serving food and directing traffic. And then he saw her. Emily stood behind the serving counter, wearing a volunteer's apron over her street clothes. Her hair was pulled back now, revealing the face he remembered so well. 10 years had added lines around her eyes and mouth, but it was unmistakably her. His ex-wife. The woman he'd lost touch with after their divorce, the one whose calls he'd stopped returning when his company started taking off. She looked up, meeting his eyes, and the ladle she was holding clattered to the floor. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by shock, then anger. She stepped back from the counter, nearly bumping into another volunteer. "Emily," he said, barely above a whisper. She turned and disappeared into the kitchen. Ethan started to follow, but a large man blocked his path. "Food lines this way, buddy. Keep it moving." Ethan got his food but couldn't eat. He watched the kitchen door, waiting for Emily to reappear. When she finally emerged, she had composed herself. She worked the rest of her shift methodically, never looking in his direction. But as the crowd thinned and the shelter prepared to close, she approached his table. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" Her voice was hard, nothing like the warm tone he remembered. "I can explain," he started, but she cut him off. "Explain what?" "How you're slumming it with the poor people. Is this some kind of rich guy's adventure?" Several nearby people turned to look at them. Ethan realized his cover was about to be blown. "Can we talk somewhere private?" Emily's laugh was bitter. "Private? There's no private out here, Ethan. Welcome to my world." She turned to leave, but he caught her arm. She yanked it away as if his touch burned. "Tomorrow," she said. "Noon. Washington Square Park, near the fountain. And Ethan, come as yourself. No more disguises." She walked away, leaving Ethan sitting at the table, his untouched food growing cold. Around him, the shelter's residents prepared for another night, unaware that their world had just collided with his in a way he never expected. The next day, Ethan arrived at Washington Square Park wearing his usual attire, a tailored suit and Italian leather shoes. The contrast between him and the park's regular occupants couldn't have been more stark. He found Emily already waiting by the fountain, still in her street clothes but cleaner than the previous night. "You're early," she said, not looking at him. "You look homeless." Emily cut him off. "That's because I am. Let's skip the small talk, Ethan. Why are you really here?" Ethan sat down beside her, maintaining a careful distance. "I was doing research. Trying to understand what life is like for people on the streets. I never expected to find you here." Research, Emily repeated the word like it tasted bitter. Of course. Everything's a business opportunity for you, isn't it? It's not like that. I wanted to help. Help. Emily's voice rose slightly. Where was your help when I called you 3 years ago? When I needed someone to talk to after James died. James. Ethan hadn't heard this name before. My husband. After you. The one who cleaned out our bank accounts and left me with his gambling debts. The one who... She stopped, touching a faded scar near her collarbone. Never mind. You were too busy building your empire to answer the phone. The truth of her words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He remembered those calls, her name popping up on his phone screen during board meetings and business dinners. He'd always told himself he'd call back later, but later never came. I didn't know, he said quietly. No, you didn't. And you didn't want to know. I was part of your past, and you'd moved on to bigger things. Emily pulled her jacket tighter despite the warm day. After James, everything fell apart. The creditors took the house. My family had already cut ties because they warned me about him and I wouldn't listen. I couldn't keep my job because I was too afraid to go to work. James's gambling friends kept showing up, demanding money. She paused, watching a group of pigeons fight over a piece of bread. You know what the worst part is? Out here, I found more loyalty and compassion than I ever did in our old life. These people, the ones you're studying like lab rats, they look out for each other. They share what little they have. Let me help now, Ethan offered. I can get you an apartment, help you start over. Emily's laugh was hollow. You still don't get it. I don't want your charity, Ethan. I'm not some project you can fix to make yourself feel better. Then what do you want? I want you to understand that this isn't about you or your guilt. These streets are full of people with stories like mine, good people who had bad luck, made wrong choices, or trusted the wrong person. While you're up in your tower making millions, they're down here trying to survive another day. A group of homeless men approached them, looking concerned. Everything okay, Emily? One asked, eyeing Ethan suspiciously. It's fine, Mike. He's leaving. She stood up. Go back to your life, Ethan. Your research is done. I'm not leaving, Ethan said firmly. You're right, I need to understand. So teach me. Show me what life is really like out here. No disguises, no pretense. Just the truth. Emily studied him for a long moment. The truth isn't pretty. I'm not looking for pretty. I'm looking for real. She sighed, running a hand through her tangled hair. Meet me at the shelter tomorrow morning. 6 a.m. Wear something that can get dirty. If you're serious about understanding, you can help serve breakfast. As Emily walked away with her protective group of friends, Ethan remained by the fountain. The weight of everything she'd revealed pressed down on him. He'd come looking to understand homelessness as an abstract concept, but instead found himself face to face with the consequences of his own actions and inactions. His phone buzzed, probably his assistant wondering why he'd cleared his schedule again. For the first time in years, the business empire he'd built felt meaningless compared to the task ahead of him. The shelter's kitchen at 5:45 a.m. was already bustling when Ethan arrived. Emily stood at a prep station, cracking eggs into a large bowl. She acknowledged him with a brief nod and pointed to a stack of aprons. Put one on. You're on toast duty. Her tone was businesslike, professional. No hint of their shared past. For the next 2 hours, Ethan worked alongside volunteers and homeless people who helped in exchange for meals. His expensive watch kept getting caught in the toaster, so he finally took it off. Burns marked his hands from hot pans, and sweat stained his casual designer shirt. During a brief lull, Emily approached his station. Follow me. There's something you need to see. She led him to a small office in the back of the shelter, where a whiteboard covered one wall. Names and numbers filled every space, along with notes about medical conditions, job interviews, and ID status. This is my real work, Emily explained. Everyone out there has a story, and I keep track of them all. Sarah needs insulin but lost her prescription. Mike has a job interview but no clean clothes. Tom's trying to reconnect with his daughter but needs a phone. Ethan studied the board. You organize all this. Someone has to. The system's broken, Ethan. These people fall through every crack, and nobody notices until it's too late. She pointed to a section of the board. See these names? All of them died last winter. Exposure, untreated medical conditions, violence. The city counted them as statistics. I counted them as friends. A commotion from the main room interrupted them. A man in an expensive suit stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 security guards. Emily's face hardened. Marcus Drake, she spat the name out. Real estate developer. He's been trying to shut us down for months. Ethan recognized the name. Drake Development was behind several controversial luxury condo projects in the area. This shelter is a blight on the neighborhood, Drake announced loudly. I have permits to begin construction next month. Either you clear out voluntarily, or we'll have the police do it for us. Emily stepped forward. We have rights. This shelter serves over 200 people every day. Rights. Drake laughed. Look around you. These people are parasites. They're dragging down property values. My investors want this block cleaned up. Ethan watched as Emily's hands clenched into fists. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. Your investors? Of course. Because profit matters more than people. Don't pretend you understand business, Drake sneered. This is progress. Development. The future. The future. Emily gestured to the crowded shelter. Tell that to the Vietnam vet who sleeps in the alley. Or the woman who fled domestic violence with her kids. Where's their future? Drake's face reddened. That's not my problem. You have 30 days. He turned to leave, then paused. And if you try to fight this, remember, accidents happen in condemned buildings. After he left, Emily slumped against the wall. He's been making threats for weeks. Someone broke our water heater last month. Then our electrical system mysteriously failed. Have you gone to the police? With what evidence? Besides, half the precinct is in his pocket. She looked at Ethan. This is what we're up against. Not just poverty and bad luck, but people who see us as obstacles to their profit margins. Ethan thought about his own business dealings. How many times had he approved projects without considering who might be displaced? How many lives had he affected without even knowing it? There has to be something we can do, he said. Emily turned back to her whiteboard, adding new names and notes. Unless you can find a way to stop a multi-million-dollar development project or convince the city to actually enforce housing regulations, all we can do is try to find new places for everyone before we're forced out. Maybe I can help with that, Ethan said slowly. I know people in the city planning office. And I have some experience with development projects. Emily looked at him skeptically. This isn't like your research project, Ethan. These are real people with real lives at stake. If you get involved, you need to be sure. Drake isn't someone you want as an enemy. Before Ethan could respond, a young woman burst into the office. Emily. Tom's having another episode. He's in the alley. Emily moved quickly. Coming. She paused at the door. Think about what I said, Ethan. Really think about it. Because once you're in this fight, there's no going back to your comfortable world of boardrooms and business deals. Ethan spent the next week dividing his time between his office and the shelter. During the day, he had his staff quietly investigate Drake Development. At night, he helped Emily with her endless task of managing the shelter's needs. The dual life was exhausting but revelatory. Look at this, Ethan said one evening, spreading documents across Emily's desk. Drake's company has purchased 7 properties in the area, all former homeless shelters or low-income housing. Each one had mysterious accidents before being condemned. Emily studied the papers. We've suspected as much, but could never prove it. How did you get these records? Money opens doors, Ethan replied. And I have better lawyers than Drake. They found something else. His company's connected to City Council member Richardson. James Richardson. Emily's head snapped up. He chairs the zoning committee. Exactly. Drake makes generous campaign contributions, and suddenly his permits get fast-tracked. But they got sloppy. Ethan pulled out more documents. These transactions don't add up. The money's being moved through shell companies, but the pattern's clear if you know where to look. A knock interrupted them. Mike, one of the shelter regulars, entered looking worried. Emily, you need to see this. They followed him to the back alley. Fresh graffiti covered the wall, clear out or burn out. The paint was still wet. Third threat this week, Emily said quietly. They're getting bolder. Ethan took photos with his phone. We need to document everything. Build a case. For what? The police won't help. Not the police. The FBI. Ethan's voice was firm. If Richardson's involved, this crosses into federal territory. Public corruption, RICO violations. Emily looked skeptical. You really think the FBI will care about a homeless shelter? They'll care about millions in laundered money and corrupt city officials. The shelter is just part of a bigger picture. He paused. But we need more evidence. I might know someone who can help, Emily said after a moment. Remember Carl, the guy who sleeps near the loading dock? He used to work construction for Drake. Got injured on the job, and they fired him instead of paying workers' comp. Can he prove any of it? Better. He says he kept records, payroll documents, work orders for the accidents at other properties. He was saving them for leverage, but Drake's people threatened his family. Ethan nodded. Where are the documents now? Storage unit across town. Carl's been paying for it with whatever change he can spare. Says it's his insurance policy. They found Carl huddled in his usual spot, wrapped in a tattered blanket. His face was weathered, but his eyes were sharp as he listened to their proposal. Those papers are all I got, he said finally. My only protection. We'll protect you, Emily promised. And your family. Carl studied them both. Drake's people, they came around last week. Offered me money for the documents. When I said no, they mentioned my daughter by name. Knew where she worked. Ethan reached for his phone. Give me her details. I'll have security at her workplace within the hour. You can do that. I can do a lot more than that. But we need those documents. Carl was quiet for a long moment. Storage units on 47th Street. Number 239. Keys in my shoe. He pulled out a small key wrapped in plastic. Just make it count. The storage unit was small and dusty. Carl's documents filled 3 boxes, meticulously organized. As they loaded them into Ethan's car, Emily noticed movement at the end of the street. We're being watched, she whispered. I know, Ethan replied calmly. I have people watching them. But we need to move fast now. Once Drake realizes we have these, he'll come at us hard. Back at the shelter, they began sorting through the documents. Work orders for staged accidents, payoffs to building inspectors, lists of properties targeted for acquisition. The evidence was damning. This is bigger than just our shelter, Emily realized. He's systematically destroying every support system for homeless people in the area. Creating his own crisis, Ethan agreed. Drive people out, property values drop, he buys cheap and develops high-end properties. Classic gentrification, but with brass knuckles. Emily's phone buzzed, a text from one of her shelter contacts. Drake's at City Hall right now, meeting with Richardson. They're pushing to expedite our eviction. Good, Ethan said grimly. Let them push. The harder they push, the more mistakes they'll make. And we'll be ready. Ethan and Emily transformed the shelter's basement into their command center. They covered the walls with photos, documents, and connection maps linking Drake to various corrupt officials. But they knew papers alone wouldn't be enough, they needed public attention. We need to make this visible, Emily said, addressing a group of shelter residents and volunteers. Drake succeeds because he keeps his victims isolated and invisible. That ends now. The campaign started small. Shelter residents shared their stories on social media. Local bloggers picked up the pattern of suspicious accidents at homeless facilities. Emily organized peaceful protests outside Drake's construction sites. This is more than just our shelter, Emily told a growing crowd. This is about everyone who's been pushed aside, forgotten, treated like they don't matter. We matter. Our lives matter. Ethan worked behind the scenes, using his business connections to pressure Drake's investors. "Look at these liability issues," he told one nervous board member. "Your shareholders won't be happy when this hits the press." But Drake fought back. One morning, they arrived to find the shelter's pipes had burst, flooding the basement. Their evidence was safe. Ethan had already moved it to a secure location, but the message was clear. "He's getting desperate," Ethan observed, watching emergency plumbers work. "Good," Emily replied. "Desperate people make mistakes." The turning point came when one of Drake's former employees reached out. Sarah Chen, his former accountant, had documentation of systematic fraud. "He fired me when I questioned some transactions," she explained, laying out spreadsheets. "But I kept copies." Force of habit. The evidence was devastating. Drake hadn't just been pushing out homeless shelters, he'd been manipulating property values across the city, using insider information from Richardson to profit from zoning changes. Emily organized their biggest event yet, a citywide forum on housing rights and corruption. Former Drake employees spoke alongside homeless residents. Journalists filled the room. Local TV stations carried it live. "This isn't just about housing," Emily told the cameras. "It's about human dignity. About whether we're going to let profit matter more than people." The shelter's residents played crucial roles. Tom, the elderly veteran, described how Drake's men had threatened him. Carl shared his story of workplace injury and retaliation. Each testimony built their case stronger. Ethan watched from the back of the room, amazed at how Emily commanded attention. This wasn't the broken woman he'd rediscovered weeks ago. This was someone who'd found her purpose. "You're good at this," he told her after the forum. "I had practice," she replied. "Living on the streets teaches you what really matters. These people, they're my family now. And family fights for each other." The campaign was working. Drake's investors started asking uncomfortable questions. City council members distanced themselves from Richardson. But success brought danger. Late one night, as they worked in the shelter office, a brick crashed through the window. The note attached read, "Back off or burn." "They're escalating," Ethan said, picking up broken glass. "Let them," Emily's voice was steel. "We've got too much momentum now. The whole city's watching." She was right. Their evidence had gone viral. #DrakeCorruption trended on social media. Protesters gathered daily outside Drake Development's offices. But their biggest weapon was the community itself. Homeless people across the city began documenting suspicious activities around their shelters. Every threat, every accident was recorded and shared. "We're not powerless anymore," Emily told her growing network of supporters. "They thought we were invisible. They thought no one would listen to us. They were wrong." Ethan watched her lead another rally, remembering the woman he'd first rediscovered weeks ago. Her transformation wasn't just about fighting Drake, it was about finding her voice, her strength. The shelter became more than just a refuge. It was a symbol of resistance, proof that the powerless could stand up to corruption. But both Ethan and Emily knew Drake wouldn't go down without a fight. "He's going to hit back hard," Ethan warned. Emily nodded. "I know. But we're ready. We've got truth on our side, and now we've got numbers too." The retaliation came swiftly. One morning, Mike rushed into the shelter office, his face pale. They got Carl. Carl had been attacked outside the shelter, beaten severely enough to require hospitalization. The message was clear: Drake was done playing games. "This is my fault," Emily said at the hospital, watching Carl's bruised face through the ICU window. "I asked him to help us." "No," Ethan responded firmly. "This is Drake's fault. And we're going to make him pay for it." Security cameras had caught the attack. The footage showed two men in dark clothes, but their faces were clear enough. Ethan's private investigators identified them within hours, former employees of a security firm frequently contracted by Drake Development. "We've got them," Ethan told Emily. "This is assault with intent. Criminal intimidation. Even Drake's pet cops can't ignore this." But the police response was predictably underwhelming. "No clear evidence linking these men to Mr. Drake," the detective said, barely glancing at their documentation. The attack on Carl changed something in the community. Fear crept in. People started avoiding the shelter during daylight hours, only coming for meals when darkness provided cover. "This is exactly what Drake wants," Emily said during an emergency meeting. "He wants us scared. Divided." Then another blow hit. Sarah Chen, the whistleblower accountant, was fired from her new job. Her apartment lease was suddenly terminated. Her car was vandalized. "They're targeting anyone who speaks out," Ethan observed grimly. He'd moved Sarah to a safe location, but the damage to morale was done. The final straw came when someone broke into the shelter at night. They didn't steal anything, instead, they left photos. Pictures of shelter residents going about their daily routines. Pictures of Emily walking home alone. Pictures of Ethan entering his office building. "He's watching all of us," Emily said, spreading the photos across her desk. "Trying to show us he can get to anyone, anytime." But Drake had miscalculated. Instead of crushing their spirit, the intimidation sparked anger. The shelter's residents, many of whom had survived far worse on the streets, refused to back down. "You want to see what scared looks like?" Tom asked at a community meeting. "Scared is sleeping under a bridge in January. Scared is not knowing where your next meal's coming from. This." He held up one of the surveillance photos. "This is just some rich bully throwing a tantrum." The community rallied. They organized neighborhood watches. Local business owners, moved by Carl's story, offered their security cameras and storage spaces. College students volunteered to escort shelter residents to jobs and appointments. Emily coordinated it all from the shelter office, which now operated around the clock. "If Drake wants to watch us," she declared, "let's give him something to see." They organized their largest demonstration yet, a peaceful march through the financial district, right past Drake Development's headquarters. Hundreds showed up, not just homeless people but supporters from across the city. The media coverage was extensive. "Developer accused of violent intimidation," read one headline. "Homeless community stands against corruption," proclaimed another. Drake's response was immediate. His lawyers sent cease and desist letters. His PR team released statements denying all allegations. But the momentum had shifted. Late one night, as Ethan and Emily reviewed security footage, a shelter resident burst in. There's smoke coming from the storage room. They rushed downstairs to find flames climbing the walls. The fire department arrived quickly, but the message was unmistakable: Drake was done with warnings. As they watched firefighters battle the blaze, Emily's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number: "Next time the building won't be empty." Ethan saw the message over her shoulder. "We need to end this. Now." Emily nodded, her face illuminated by the flashing emergency lights. "Agreed. But ending it means going all in. No more playing defense." "What are you thinking? Drake's not just fighting us anymore. He's fighting the whole community. Let's show him what that really means." In the aftermath of the fire, Ethan and Emily worked late into the night, coordinating temporary housing for displaced residents. The close quarters and shared crisis brought them closer than they'd been in years. "Remember our first apartment?" Emily asked suddenly, passing Ethan a cup of coffee. "That tiny studio in Queens? With the leaky faucet that never stopped dripping," Ethan nodded. "We couldn't afford to fix it. But we were happy." She paused. When did money become more important than happiness? The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken regrets. Before Ethan could respond, they heard commotion outside. Drake had arrived at the scene, accompanied by news crews and his lawyers. "This is exactly why these buildings need to be condemned," Drake announced to the cameras. "They're fire hazards. We're protecting these people by developing safe, modern housing." Emily started toward the door, fury in her eyes, but Ethan caught her arm. "Wait. Let him talk." Drake continued his performance. "These activists are endangering lives by encouraging people to stay in unsafe conditions. My company offers progress, safety, a better future for everyone." "Everyone who can afford luxury condos, you mean?" Emily called out, stepping forward. The news cameras swung toward her. Drake's practiced smile faltered. "Miss Thomas. I'm surprised you're still here. Haven't you caused enough damage?" "The only damage here was caused by your thugs," Emily replied, her voice carrying clearly. Just like they damaged Carl and Sarah's life and every other shelter you've destroyed. Careful, Miss Thomas. Allegations like that are slanderous. Truth is an absolute defense against slander, Ethan said, moving to stand beside Emily. And we have proof. Drake's eyes narrowed as he recognized Ethan. Mr. Clark. I wasn't aware you'd taken an interest in local real estate. I'm interested in justice, Ethan replied. And in stopping corrupt businessmen who think they can buy their way out of anything. The confrontation drew a crowd. Shelter residents gathered behind Emily and Ethan. News crews pushed closer, sensing drama. Drake's lawyer whispered something in his ear, but he waved him off. You're making a mistake, Clark. This isn't your fight. You made it my fight when you started hurting innocent people. Innocent. Drake laughed. Look around you. These people are parasites. They contribute nothing. He never finished. One of the shelter residents, a former teacher who'd lost everything to medical debt, stepped forward. I taught your daughter in 3rd grade, Mr. Drake. Before your company's development project forced our school to close. Want to call me a parasite to my face? Others joined in, each with a story of how Drake's actions had affected their lives. The news cameras captured it all. Drake's composure cracked. This is ridiculous. I won't stand here and be attacked by... By what? Emily demanded. By the people whose lives you've destroyed. By the community you thought wouldn't fight back. Drake moved toward her, his face twisted with rage. You little... Ethan stepped between them. Touch her, and the assault charges will be the least of your problems. The tension was electric. Police officers moved closer, hands on their belts. News cameras whirred. The whole city seemed to hold its breath. Then Drake made his fatal mistake. You think you can stop me, he snarled. I own this city. The mayor, the council, the cops, they all know who butters their bread. By this time tomorrow, you'll all be arrested for trespassing. And accidents happen in jail, don't they? His words were caught clearly on camera. The threat hung in the air, impossible to take back. Emily smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. Thank you, Mr. Drake. That was exactly what we needed. Drake realized his error too late. Behind the news cameras, federal agents were already moving in. The next 24 hours moved at a dizzying pace. Drake's public threat, combined with the evidence they'd gathered, gave federal authorities everything they needed. FBI agents raided Drake development offices and Councilman Richardson's home simultaneously. Emily watched the news coverage from the temporary shelter they'd set up in a church basement. They found Richardson shredding documents, she told the gathered residents. And Drake tried to flee but was stopped at the airport. The investigation uncovered more than they'd expected. Drake's corruption extended beyond housing. He'd been involved in voter suppression, environmental violations, and systematic harassment of low-income communities across the city. The DA is offering plea deals to Drake's associates, Ethan explained during a community meeting. They're turning on each other. The whole network is falling apart. Sarah Chen's documentation proved crucial. Her meticulous records showed money trails leading to offshore accounts, bribes to officials, and payments to thugs who'd carried out the intimidation. But the real victory came from an unexpected source. The footage of Drake's tirade went viral. His mask of respectability had cracked, revealing the ugliness beneath. Corporate sponsors withdrew. Investors jumped ship. His empire began to crumble. The city's launching an investigation into all condemned properties, Emily announced to cheers from the shelter residents. Any building closed under suspicious circumstances will be reviewed. And they're fast-tracking permits for new homeless shelters. The mayor's office, desperate to distance itself from the scandal, established a task force on housing rights. They wanted Emily to lead it. Me, she asked when the offer came. I'm not qualified. You're exactly qualified, Ethan argued. You understand the real issues. You've lived them. The church basement became a hub of activity as they planned the shelter's reconstruction. Donations poured in from across the city. Contractors offered their services pro bono. Even Drake's former employees came forward to help, eager to make amends. We're not just rebuilding a shelter, Emily told reporters. We're building a model for how communities can fight back against corruption and win. The DA's office kept them updated on the case. Drake and Richardson were facing serious federal charges. The evidence was overwhelming, and more witnesses came forward daily. But the most significant change was in the community itself. People who'd been invisible for years found their voices. The shelter residents organized advocacy groups, job training programs, support networks. This was never just about Drake, Emily said during a planning session. It was about proving that every person matters. That no one is disposable. Ethan watched her work, seeing how naturally she'd stepped into her leadership role. The fearful woman he'd rediscovered weeks ago was gone, replaced by someone who'd found her purpose. The mayor's office called again, he told her one evening. They want to expand the task force's scope. Make it a permanent commission on housing justice. Emily looked up from her papers. What did you tell them? That they'd have to talk to you. But. He hesitated. I think you should do it. You could make real changes, systematic ones. It's funny, she said after a moment. A month ago, I was just trying to survive. Now you're changing the city. The reconstruction plans were finalized. The new shelter would be bigger, with facilities for job training, medical care, and legal aid. But more importantly, it would be protected. The city council, eager to repair its image, passed regulations preventing the exploitation of vulnerable communities. Drake thought he could erase us, Emily told the gathered crowd at the groundbreaking ceremony. He thought we didn't matter. But he forgot something important: when people stand together, when they refuse to be silent, they can't be ignored. The morning of Drake's arraignment, Ethan received an unexpected call. His mother, whom he hadn't spoken to in years, was waiting in his office. There's something you need to know, she said, her hands trembling as she opened an old envelope. Inside were letters, photographs, and a birth certificate. It's about your father. The truth hit like a physical blow. The birth certificate showed a different name than the one Ethan had grown up with. The name was Marcus Drake Sr. Your real father, his mother explained quietly. He abandoned us before you were born. I married John Clark when you were 2. We never told you because Marcus Drake was already becoming the man you know now. Ethan stared at a photo of a younger Mark. Us Drake. The resemblance was undeniable. Does he know? He found out when you started making headlines in the business world. That's why he never directly competed with your company. That's why he tried to warn me off this fight, Ethan finished. He wasn't just protecting his business. He was trying to keep this secret. The revelation left Ethan reeling. He drove to the shelter automatically, his mind churning. Emily found him sitting in the office, the documents spread before him. I need to tell you something, he began. As he explained, Emily's expression shifted from shock to understanding. The press conference, she said. It's in 2 hours. Drake's lawyers are offering a plea deal. If this comes out, it changes everything, Emily finished. Or nothing. That's your choice. Ethan looked at the photos of shelter residents on the wall, at the rebuilding plans, at everything they'd fought for. Does blood matter more than what's right? You tell me, Emily said softly. The man who raised you, John Clark, was he your father? In every way that mattered. Then you have your answer. The courthouse steps were crowded with press when they arrived. Drake's lawyers were announcing the plea deal, minimal jail time in exchange for cooperation against other defendants. Ethan stepped to the microphones. Drake, being led inside, froze when he saw him. I have a statement to make, Ethan began. The cameras turned. Today, Marcus Drake will try to buy his way out of responsibility, just as he's always done. But some things can't be bought. He pulled out the birth certificate. Drake's face went pale. Marcus Drake is my biological father, Ethan announced. The crowd gasped. But today, I stand with the people he tried to destroy. Because family isn't about blood. It's about choices. It's about standing up for what's right. Emily moved to his side, taking his hand. Drake watched, his last leverage crumbling. The plea deal is rejected, the DA announced moments later. Mr. Drake will face full prosecution. In the aftermath, reporters clamored for interviews, but Ethan and Emily slipped away. They walked to the shelter, where the community they'd built waited. Was it worth it? Emily asked as they approached. Exposing everything. Ethan watched the shelter residents working on the reconstruction, each one carrying their own story of survival and resilience. Family isn't what you're born into, he said. It's what you choose to build. And what are you choosing to build? He squeezed her hand. Something real. Something that matters. Inside, the shelter was alive with activity. Plans were being made, lives were being rebuilt, and hope was taking root. They had faced down corruption, confronted painful truths, and emerged stronger. We're not done, Emily said, looking at the work ahead. No, Ethan agreed. We're just beginning. The truth about Drake had shaken him, but it had also freed him. In rejecting his biological father's path, he had found his own. And in the community they'd built together, both he and Emily had found something neither wealth nor power could buy: a place to belong, a purpose to serve, and a love that had survived the hardest of times. The end.